Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's really nice. It sounds like we have a full spectrum of people in the room, from folks who haven't worked at all in school feeding, all the way through people who have pretty extensive and deep experience, both like practically on the applied side with WFP and others, and then also more from the policy perspective. So it will be wonderful to hear your thoughts and inputs through this session to make this a little bit richer. So by Archimedes, give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, and I shall move the world. So I was thinking about this, I kind of stumbled into this quote again the other day and was thinking about this session and thinking about food systems, naturally. And wanted to sort of start off with a question for everybody to reflect on and maybe share if anything comes to mind. What do you think would be a good lever that could potentially create change through all domains of the food system, like somewhat simultaneously? And there's school feeding isn't necessarily the answer on this, but curious to hear if folks, kind of what comes to mind for people as certain types of interventions or policies that might really touch across every single domain.
Well, I feel that the food environment is a key lever to create change across all domains of the food system. I think what people have access to, what they can buy, what they can purchase, is what they would end up eating, even with all the education and counseling for people to choose healthy diets. They will go for what is available, what is affordable to them. And so the food environment creates what is accessible and therefore what people consume. And so if you really want to make change, that's for me where to start from. In places where, for instance, there's very little regulation of what people sell and what is available, you will see an influx of unhealthy foods, sugar-sweetened beverages especially, all over the country, like where I'm coming from, Ghana. And they are very cheap. Sometimes they are cheaper than bottles of water. And so people really would end up consuming them. And so if you have policies that, control the food environment, regulate the food environment, and drive healthier food environments, then people are more likely to choose healthier diets, even those that naturally wouldn't want to. That's what I want to say.
Great, thank you for that input. So I think that that's one perspective, right? Really focusing in on specifically on the food environment domain, and then having the kind of trickle down from there in terms of consumer behavior and purchasing and diets. Anybody else, other thoughts? I'm thinking maybe even at the bigger scale, like something that could have a system-wide shift that could change both the supply chain and kind of the production end of things all the way through.
Public procurement policies. So it would be school meals or even other public institutions serving meals, and policies around what you serve there and what you buy and where you buy it from.
Great. And do you want to talk through it all, like specifically in the domains, how you would see that?
Sure.
If we can go back to the slide. Yeah, thank you.
So that would influence if, for example, in the United States, or where I now work in the United Kingdom, the government is a big purchaser of food. So if they change their policies on what they're going to buy, it would affect food supply chains, and that might trickle down to the food environment, what is available for other people to purchase as well.
So thank you for mapping that out. Any other thoughts or ideas? Yeah, there's one back there.
I honestly just want to add on what she said. For example, in Malawi, if there were less than taxes on healthy foods, and if you make them accessible to the people who usually buy energy-dense food, sugar-sweetened beverages, if you give them healthy options, and also giving them an environment where they are knowledgeable and they're ready to change or something like that, giving nutrition professionals a chance, all of that can help in changing the food system in general, because it will affect everything, including the food supply chain, the food environment, individual factors, because you're helping them meet with nutrition professionals, seeing where they're ready to change and consumer behavior, what they buy, and that will in turn affect the diet. So yeah.
Excellent. That's another great example of a sort of regulatory intervention that could have that ripple effect throughout. So all of this thinking lines up with the work of the Rockefeller Foundation, which of the examples that were given has chosen the second one, the middle option of institutional purchasing or procurement as a really good entry point for system-wide food system change. And they've mapped it out in terms of really seeing an upstream benefit on the production side of things through the processing and distribution, therefore affecting availability and accessibility, potentially also prices, and then also all the way down through the consumption side, right? So we're seeing a downstream effect. And in the case of school meals, that's also in terms of generational shifts over time and shaping behaviors and tastes of children potentially as they're exposed to foods in the schools themselves. So it can have long-term effects on consumer taste and behavior. And we have a couple examples. Okay, thanks, Elena. Yeah, anybody feel free to interrupt me with suggestions. We have a couple examples of institutional purchasing as a lever for long-term change in the food system. I'd be happy to debate at the end of this session, you know, are these good directions or bad directions, and what are the long-term impacts of some of these changes, and how would we want to motivate change in school feeding, for example. But so these are just three cases. The first one from Kenya, where there was a school milk program implemented in the 1980s that supported dairy production in the country and raised consumption significantly compared to neighboring countries. We have an example from the US, and when the Army decided to only purchase fortified flour, which in turn increased demand for fortified flour. Again, we can debate if this is good or bad or otherwise, but we have since fully integrated fortified flours into the market. And then in 2013 in India, there was the first pilot which introduced fortified rice into the school midday meals in India, which is a huge program. And by 2021, India became entirely self-sufficient in fortified kernel production and has since reached over 400 million people in the country. So just as an example of how, you know, by making an institutional or procurement shift, there's then been this ripple effect throughout the types of foods that are available within the food system, in the food environment, and what people are eating at the end of or throughout every day. So the Rockefeller Foundation has called this effort the power of procurement. And it's a project that they have ongoing that's linked, and there's a little bit of an issue with the slide here, but it's linked with the World Food Program, and I believe with other people at this point, but they're interested in directly impacting individuals in the population, leveraging institutional food procurement to enable healthier meals in a budget neutral way. So they're really making sure that all of the switches are budget neutral and thinking about market strategies and regulatory systems throughout. And they see, you know, the outcomes across both governments, individual people in the country, and suppliers themselves. So school meals, as you have probably guessed by now, are sort of the focus of this institutional procurement work. They're the largest global food safety net today, and at this point have pretty strong global momentum behind them through the School Meals Coalition and others who are working in this area. So for those of you who aren't exposed to school meal work or haven't benefited from them in your life, these programs typically provide lunch, well, breakfast, lunch, or both to students. Typically, national budgets fund these programs, and depending on the country, it can also be a portion of donors and the private sector covering some part of that. They're run by national governments and often with support from nonprofits and other humanitarian organizations like WFP, as you know. But there are some challenges that remain kind of in place between what could be the actual impact of school meals and what happens today. And so very similar to the case of nutrition that tends to fall somewhere between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Agriculture, and in some contexts and countries, there aren't clear champions or clear institutional offices to carry the work of nutrition. School feeding is sort of similar in that it falls between the cracks of the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Agriculture, depending on the country. So that's just something that can slow down the process of having very strong, impactful school meals. Also, fiscal budgets in this area tend to be extremely tight, and due to rising interest rates and other concerns, there's, typically what I've seen since I've been working in this space is that budgets are pretty consistently very, very small in terms of the amount of money allocated per child per school lunch. And then finally, there's a need to kind of think bigger. And this is, again, what Rockefeller is really pushing for, but to ensure that programs are designed to achieve the full potential and aims beyond just short-term food security needs, right? So really thinking about school meals as a potential to impact long-term behavior and health outcomes of students, but also potentially of the environment. And so seeing an entry point on both of those pieces. So their interest, the Rockefeller Foundation itself, is they're interested in growing the political support to increase provision of school meals. They're interested, and this is where our work with intake comes in making school meals better. So really looking at food-related research and innovation and practice to advocate for more climate resilient and better food provision within the schools. And then also helping to make the whole school feeding system more sustainable. And some of this is where the budget neutral work comes in, amongst other areas. So, all of this is leading to the point to really try to make school meals nutrition positive, climate positive and climate smart, budget neutral, and then locally sourced foods when and as appropriate. And so some examples of this that Rockefeller and others are working on is to try to integrate fortified whole grains into school systems, biofortified foods, and more seasonal fruits and vegetables. So just a snapshot on the school meals front globally and kind of where things stand. It's, I don't think news to anybody in this room that there's lots of food insecurity as well as nutrition problems. So particularly amongst children, these estimates of, in this case, of undernourishment, which is, let's say, we can talk about the indicator itself later. We see though that levels are increasing. So anyway, long story short here, I think you saw the rest of the slides in the meantime, so you get the picture. But it's basically that, while we have this issue of increasing food insecurity, also overlapping with COVID, one of the sort of, I don't want to say benefits, but one of the things that came out during COVID was that there was this concerted effort and move towards really finding ways to deliver school meals despite all the disruptions to education. And so between 2020 and 2022, we saw an increase in the number of children receiving school meals globally. Go to the next slide, please. We also see this reflected on the continent here where, the data I have are from 2013 to 2019, where we see almost doubling of the number of children who have access to school meals. And we can see that in Malawi, the number of children receiving school meals is over 1 million, but that's the same for many countries in the region where we have the dark green shaded area. So, this effort is well underway. Next slide, please. Thank you. So just on this very high level snapshot of school feeding, I think that the point here is school feeding programs are a major source of procurement. Almost all countries in the world have them. They do play a significant role in the nutrition of children globally with potential intergenerational effects. In many cases, a school meal may be the only or best meal that a child is consuming that day. And there remains untapped potential for potentially benefiting both health and the environment in terms of school meal procurement. Okay, so with all of that in the background and where I come in and where the Intake Center for Dietary Assessment comes in, is that despite the potential importance of the area of school feeding and procurement in general, there's no single standardized global metric to capture the quality of meals and menus in institutional settings. And I'm using the term here institutional settings for schools, but also for prisons, hospitals, cafeterias, work cafeterias, so on and so forth, where a fixed meal is served that could potentially be evaluated, and then motivated change could come from that. Next slide, please. So I know a few of you were at the GDQS Learning Lab on Monday, but many of you weren't. So this is separate from that. I'm not going to get too much into the details of the Global Diet Quality Score, which is what GDQS stands for, but happy to talk about that separately. So we can go to the next slide. I'll just give a brief background on what the GDQ. First, I'll talk about, thank you. First, I'll talk about the Global Diet Quality Meal metric, just at a high level, which is that this is a metric that's been designed to measure the meal and menu quality in institutional feeding settings. And it's intended for use for both designing, monitoring, and evaluating the quality of meals at the standard setting phase, and then also compare, like potentially using that to compare to what's actually served, or simply at the school level when it is served. Next slide, please. And some of the expectations of this metric when we started were to ensure that the GDQS, the Global Diet Quality Score for meals, would be appropriate for use in different contexts. Of course, that it could be used globally and universally interpretable, that it would be comprehensive and able to reflect both risks for nutrient inadequacy and diet-related non-communicable diseases, that it would be responsive and sensitive and able to capture subtle changes between meals and also menus. So simple and easy to use. This was a very key criteria from the Rockefeller perspective to make sure that policymakers and stakeholders at all levels, you know, from teachers, parents, students, and the general public could understand the meaning of it. Be able to be easily integrated. So mapping meals to the complete diet was a criteria. The data collection could be low cost and easy, and that the metric would be valid, of course. So with this background in mind, you can go to the next slide, please. The foundational sort of scientific principles of the Global Diet Quality Score meal metric are drawn from what I'm going to refer to today as the parent GDQS. So it's the parent Global Diet Quality Score. And the original GDQS itself was developed by Intake, by the Harvard School of Public Health, and the National Public Health Institute in Mexico. And this work took place several years ago and has since been validated with the results published. The validation work showed that it was predictive of both nutrient adequacy and diet-related NCDs in women and men across, like using secondary GDQS. That it's a simple diet quality metric. So by that, I mean it's entirely food-based. There's no food composition information or complicated conversion factors that are necessary. It's relatively easy to collect data, and it has been validated and can be used globally. Next slide, please. So the GDQS meal, and if you aren't confused yet by all this GDQS, thank you for sticking with me. The GDQS meal metric does use the same food groups as the parent GDQS. So I just have here an image of what the food groups are. There's 25 of them in total, 16 that are healthy, 7 that are considered unhealthy, and 2 that are only considered unhealthy when consumed in excess, which you can see in the middle, the high-fat dairy and red meat. So we've taken these same food groups and a lot of the same principles of the parent GDQS metric and are using them in the GDQS meal. So some of the differences, this will only be relevant, I guess, to the extent that you're familiar with the GDQS parent indicator, but some of the differences between the GDQS meal and the GDQS parent indicator are that, as you know, in the case of the foods that are served to children, we're able to collect information on the precise quantities, right? So with the GDQS parent indicator, it's a recall-based method in which respondents have to try to figure out how much food they consumed in the previous day. In the case of the GDQS meal, we know exactly well, if we're at the school level, we're able to measure exactly what's being served to the student. And so for this indicator, we take the precise quantity of food that's been served to at the student level, or we could, if we aren't able to measure the exact plate. Then at the procurement level, we can look at how many kilograms of each commodity goes to the school and how many students there are and take the per capita value. So anyway, we measure the precise quantity of food served. We're also using a linearized score. So rather than with the GDQS, which uses a scoring system that is a 0, 1, 2 kind of score, in this case, we give fractions of points when even small quantities are served. And that's just to kind of acknowledge and allow for the fact that, of course, in like every little part of the food that's served matters in this case, whereas the GDQS is a bit more stringent in how the points are awarded. We also, as part of this metric, provide points for fortification and biofortification, and then also for food group diversity across a selection of the quote healthy food groups. As I had mentioned, this work is currently being validated. Well, the gram cutoffs for different age groups are currently being validated for children 24 to 59 months, 5 to 9 years, and 10 to 14 years. And then for children over 14 years of age, this is already accounted for in the existing validation work that's been done. And another change that we've made is to scale the score so that the total is out of 100. And this is really to ease interpretation for policymakers and others. It was deemed important. Next slide, please. So the scoring components for the GDQS meal come from, just to kind of summarize that previous slide, come from the points that are given for the healthy and unhealthy food groups in a linearized fashion. So there's, again, a lot more nuance here. Then points that are awarded for fortified and biofortified foods based on 16 micronutrients, and then points given for the diversity of healthy food groups, plus the two food groups that are only considered unhealthy when consumed in excess. So this is some very preliminary data, actually from before I joined the project, from a joint effort between WFP and Rockefeller Foundation in Rwanda. We have similar sort of related efforts ongoing in Burundi and India right now, measuring meal quality at different levels. But this is just one kind of snapshot of how this type of score might be of interest. This is school level data, but how, if we're measuring the meals that are served at schools across a country or across states in a country, able to look at how the quality of the meal varies in different seasons across different times in the month, and really using that as a way to encourage positive change and selection of different types of and combinations of foods. And there are a couple things just to think about here also when we're thinking about what aspect of school meals are we measuring. So at the highest level, menus are planned usually at nationally or at the state level. And one level at which the GDQS meal could be used is to evaluate the kind of meal or menu that's planned, the theoretical meal or menu that's planned at the state level. Another, I guess, like going down to the middle there, and we can also look at what's been planned versus what's actually served at the school level and see where those things vary. That may or may not be of interest to users of the GDQS meal. But there are just multiple entry points. That's multiple entry points here in terms of looking at GDQS, what's planned, what's been procured at the state level. This is something that WFP is particularly interested. So measuring what's procured and then the number of students that's going to serve. So really a per capita measure, basically, versus measuring what's actually served in the schools. And then finally, at the very bottom, there's this question about, well, what's served versus what's consumed, well, and what's wasted by the student or and that gets into a space of the GDQS, which the GDQS meal is designed to measure what's served. But if we want to start thinking about what's actually consumed, then that's a different measurement tool altogether. Next slide, please. So this is some photos that I took somewhat recently in Cotonou, but just to demonstrate really at the school level, that they have a menu that's planned for the entire week. They have the amount of food that's anticipated for each sort of the ration per day. They have the quantities that are there on in the picture in the far right. The foods are prepared and the foods are served. So each of these entry points, again, whether it's at a state level or at the actual school level, provide a potential opportunity to measure what's being done, and then to have a comparison across schools or across states or across countries to evaluate the quality of the meals served. I'm not going to talk through this in detail because there's a lot going on here, but I just wanted to highlight that this is it's sort of like a branch out of this work, but it's happening in parallel, a collaboration with FAO, ourselves, Intake, IFPRI, and the University of Ghana to kind of test out this, like the measurement of school meals at each of these levels. And some of the work that's going on at IFPRI is also to develop an image-based app where students could take pictures of their food and then be able to measure the dietary diversity and also the global diet quality score with those images. So that's really on the actual consumption side. But just to say there's a plan in place to kind of try to get at measurement at each one of those links to understand a little bit more. Next slide, please. So I think this is my last slide, and I'm happy to open it up for discussion. But just to highlight, like, this is very much ongoing work, and there's some future plans that are taking shape right now, but ongoing work in terms of the collaboration with WFP. We're in the process, in addition to the work in pilot countries, we're also integrating it into, they have a pretty elaborate monitoring system within the institution to measure the procurement process of foods at the school level across countries where they work. So the GDQS Meal is being integrated into that system to inform both people at the country level and also, across the WFP program. It's also being integrated into, they have a program called S&P Plus, which is a menu planning program used by governments all over the world. So the GDQS Meal will be integrated into that, and that meal planning program gives users feedback on the budget, on the nutrient adequacy, and then now also on the diet quality or the meal quality based on its metric. We're also developing a menu metric, so thinking beyond just the day, but how the day over time, so the menu over a week, is affecting the quality of the overall consumption. We're anticipating that we'll expand this metric to also include environmental impacts. And this is other parallel work that we have ongoing at Intake, but is a matter at this point of linking up those two streams of work. We see beyond school feeding, and as we talked about at the beginning, the public procurement piece is really also extends to hospitals, dining halls, potentially prisons. And so the extent that there's traction and interest in something like this could be expanded to there. We're working on an app to aid with data collection. We have a couple of different modalities right now for data collection at the school level, but we think that the app may help simplify that. So an example is we've been in touch with the cafeteria at Google in California, USA, and they were interested in using this metric, but wanted to have an easier way for data collection, basically to understand what's being consumed. And yeah, so ultimately, I think, the vision from the Rockefeller side, and then everybody who's participated in the metric development so far, really sees this metric as having potential to become a kind of globally used metric to help monitor school meals and menu quality and encourage investment in more climate smart school meals and programs once it's linked up with the environmental impact data as well. Okay, so thank you all for your attention and patience. I am at the end of that presentation.